You're watching VinylicPumaGaming. Okay guys, so I know what you're thinking. Isn't this video, well, racist? You know what? It might just be. I hate to say it, but some races in Skyrim are just plain better than some of the others. And according to Merriam-Webster, and I quote, "Racism is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race." I think we all know that the Nords of Windhelm are pretty racist towards the Dark Elves. Even High Elves are getting in on some of that racist action. Is it their motto? The superiority of mare over man? Alright, before somebody gets really pissed at me, today I'm going to be going over what I think are the worst races for a starting character in Skyrim Remastered, Special Edition, Ultimate Edition, Definitive Edition. You get the idea. For the uninitiated, Skyrim has 10 different races. Each race starts out with boosts to specific skills. Each race has a unique race power and a unique racial effect. The racial effect is a passive bonus like some kind of damage resistance, while the unique race power has to be activated and can only be used once a day, and sort of works like magic does. With that said, while all races in Skyrim start off in different ways with specific aptitudes, for the most part, any player can make any race whatever they want. For example, you could make an orc mage or a high elf warrior if you really wanted to. And it is important to keep in mind that when I criticize the races here, I do so realizing that all of the races are mostly templates, and to a certain extent, it doesn't really matter which one you pick. So don't get triggered, I guess. Without further ado, these will be the top 5 worst races in Elder Scrolls Skyrim Special Edition / Remastered, starting now. Number 5, the Imperials. In my mind, the Imperials are the weakest of the human races in Skyrim, the others being the Redguard, Bretons, and the Nords as the human races. Overall, you'll find that the Imperial starting skill boosts are okay, starting with 20 points in heavy armor, block, one-handed, destruction, and enchanting. And the starting skill Imperials specialize in the most is the Restoration tree. All Imperials start with 25 points in Restoration. Now, I only really see 2 problems with the way the starting skills are allocated for the Imperials, and those are for both the Restoration tree and the Destruction magic. It's worth mentioning that the Restoration School of Magic is useful for healing your character or your companions, and the ability to heal without consumable items such as potions or food is quite useful. However, I think you will ultimately find that it's easier to use a shield than it is to use a ward, and you'll also find that if you're fighting the undead in Skyrim, it's usually either a skeleton, draugr, vampire, or some variation of each. If you ask me, you're better off using a silver sword or a greatsword if you plan on tackling the undead, or if you manage to find it, you might even be better off with using the Dawnbreaker sword. Beyond that, you could use something with exceptional base damage like a Daedric or a Dragonbone weapon, and this of course would be an alternative to heavily investing perk points into some of the lesser perks within the Restoration tree. My problem with the Destruction tree is mostly just because Destruction magic becomes fairly limited towards the end of the game, since there aren't very many ways to increase your damage beyond taking specific perks or consuming potions. Ultimately, it's not that big of an issue, but I think the starting skill point allocation here for the Imperials would be better if it was used in speech or something else. I will admit the one thing that Imperials do well is their racial effect, which is called Imperial Luck. This ability allows Imperials to find more gold in chests, and can be useful both early on in the game and later on in the game. If you have both Imperial Luck and a perk called Golden Touch, which is part of the lockpicking tree, you can acquire the ability to amass gold very quickly. So maybe if you have problems with cash flow and you're always running out of money, you may want to play as the Imperial race. At the same time, this awesome passive effect is ruined by Voice of the Emperor, which is the Imperial's racial power. All this is a glorified calm spell from the Illusion School of Magic, and what makes this worse is that there are spells like Pacify and Harmony, which are both superior to calm as they affect enemies of higher levels. Like all other magic spells throughout the game, calm can be casted by any character. Granted, the Voice of the Emperor effect is an area of effects kind of skill, where the calm spell is not. For calm, you have to shoot it directly at an enemy. However, at the same time, Harmony is a massive area of effect spell like Voice of the Emperor that can be cast multiple times a day, so do you really need Voice of the Emperor? Ultimately, I guess the Imperials could be a lot worse, but I do think they are the weakest of the human races in Skyrim. Number 4, the Khajiit. This may be a choice that really upsets some people. I have to admit that it was sort of difficult for me to choose between both of the beast races in Skyrim, as both have fairly underwhelming passive abilities. However, between the Khajiit and the Argonian definitely has the better racial power. As far as starting skills go, the Khajiit is pretty standard. You're getting boosts to one-handed, archery, lockpicking, pickpocket, and alchemy. And the Khajiit's highest starting skill is sneak, which could be very useful early on for stealth combat, especially at nighttime. The Khajiit boosts almost the same skills as another race that I will be discussing later on in this video. However, keep in mind, just because the Khajiit starts off with a specific set of starting skills doesn't necessarily make it bad. Just like the vast majority of the other races in Skyrim, the Khajiit's downfall is mostly due to both its unique race powers as well as its unique racial effects. And when it comes to unique racial effects, the Khajiit gains enhanced damage while fighting unarmed. Assuming you are going to play through Skyrim with an unarmed build, the Khajiit are actually pretty good and they're going to be your best bet. That said, you'll ultimately find that using either a melee weapon or a ranged weapon like a bow or a crossbow is going to be considerably more effective than unarmed combat. When combined with sneak, you'll find that ranged weapons are going to be much easier to use than your fists. As I alluded to earlier, the other problem with the Khajiit is their unique racial ability. When compared to the Argonian's Hist skin ability, the Khajiit's Night's Eye ability just doesn't cut it. While enhanced eyesight at night isn't totally terrible, the ability to regenerate health 10 times faster is much more useful. Not to mention that if you decide to become a vampire as any race, you'll gain Vampire Sight, which is essentially the same thing as the Khajiit's Night's Eye power. Unlike previous Elder Scrolls games, Skyrim is much brighter at night too. If you're having problems seeing at night in Skyrim, the best solution is just to turn the contrast up both within the game's display option as well as on your TV or a monitor. Ultimately, I think you're going to find that the Khajiit is pretty lacking when it comes to unique skills and or abilities. Number 3, the Dark Elf. Just like the Khajiit, this will also be another choice that may upset some people. The skill boosts on the Dark Elf incorporate no warrior skills and instead boost things like light armor, sneak, alchemy, illusion, destruction, and alteration. And for the most part, these skill boosts aren't that bad. Light armor can be just as good as heavy armor towards endgame. Sneak is always good, and even boosts to the alchemy, illusion, and alteration skill trees are nice. The Dark Elves, along with the Bretons and High Elves, are also one of 3 races that start with 3 spells at the beginning of the game instead of 2. The problem with Dark Elves is the boost to destruction. As I mentioned earlier, Bethesda intentionally or unintentionally nerfed the viability of destruction magic in Skyrim, and the only way to increase your damage with destruction magic is to acquire the augmented magic perks, which are a good start, or you'll need to craft fortified destruction magic potions. Assuming you have the special edition or just Skyrim with all the DLC, you can also acquire the unique Dragon Priest masks from the Dragonborn DLC for Skyrim as an alternative way to boost destruction magic damage. I guess the trade-off here is that you can reduce destruction spell cast cost to 0, provided you have enough fortified destruction armor equipped to your character. So while you can't boost damage easily, it is pretty easy to reduce the destruction spell costs. It's also worth mentioning that, like the Imperials, the Dark Elves have a decent passive ability, which is a 50% resistance to fire damage. This can actually be somewhat helpful up against certain types of enemies like dragons that breathe fire and mages that specialize in fire destruction type magic. Dark Elves would also make great vampires, as their inherent racial ability helps cancel out some of the weakness to fire that vampires normally experience. On the flip side, The Dark Elf race power is absolutely terrible. Ancestor's Wrath is virtually the same thing as the Flame Cloak spell that any character of any race can use. What's worse is that you can only cast Ancestor's Wrath once per day. Flame Cloak, on the other hand, can be cast more than one time per day, and you can make the magic cost almost zero with Fortify Destruction enchantments on armor. You can even dual cast Flame Cloak, which doubles its range as well. At the end of the day, the only reason you might pick a Dunmer is if you want to play as a vampire. Otherwise, the starting skill point allocation and unique race powers of the Dunmer range from pretty average to awful. Number 2, the Wood Elf. For all intents and purposes, it appears that the Bosmer, or the Wood Elves as they're known, are essentially one of Skyrim's pure thief races along with the Khajiit. This is because Bosmer start out with starting skill point boosts in light armor, sneak, lockpicking, pickpocket, and alchemy. The highest starting skill point boost goes to archery, the idea being that Wood Elves tend to specialize with bows or crossbows. Admittedly, I would say the starting skill point allocation on the Wood Elf isn't that bad. In fact, it's actually fairly decent if you tend on sneaking around. However, just as I mentioned with the Khajiit, keep in mind that all characters of all races can acquire level 100 in each tree. The Wood Elf, like all of the other races on this list, becomes a problem when you start to look at its unique race power and its unique racial effects. The Wood Elves get both 50% poison and disease damage resistance. Ironically, this is equivalent, if not better, than the Redguard's unique racial effect. In a weird sort of way, you could say that the Wood Elf combines the inherent resistances of both the Argonian and the Redguard together. At the same time, both of these resistances are sort of underwhelming if you ask me. While disease resistance is okay and can prevent things like Witbane, poison resistance is pretty lousy. There are only a few animals in Skyrim that deal poison damage, and you'll very rarely, if ever, fight enemies with poisoned weapons. If you decide to become a werewolf, don't pick the Wood Elf, as werewolves gain 100% disease resistance when they transform, and I would also recommend against becoming a vampire, as vampires inherently have 100% poison resistance from the start. The unique race power to Wood Elves is Command Animal, and as you might have guessed, this ability is abysmal. While it may help you early on in Skyrim from random Sabercat attacks, towards the end of the game, you'll find that the Animal Allegiance Dragon Shout does the exact same thing. Not to mention that since it's a Dragon Shout, you can perform the ability multiple times per day, and you don't have to be a Bosmer to even do it. While the Wood Elf race may appear to be an appealing choice at first, the racial powers and effects that you're getting here are pretty lame. If you want to sneak, play as any other race. And finally, number 1, the Orc. The Orc is probably the worst race to choose in Skyrim, and this is a shame because some of the starting skill boosts here are pretty nice. You figure if your Wood Elf was your stealth race, the High Elf was your mage race, the Orcs would be your warrior race. The starting skills for Orcs include smithing, heavy armor, block, two-handed, and one-handed. The only other skill Orcs get a boost in is enchanting. The highest starting skill, of course, is heavy armor, and while you may find that heavy armor provides better protection at the very beginning of Skyrim, once you achieve an armor rating of 540 to 560 or so, you're going to get the maximum amount of damage resistance available. Both the high-end light and heavy armors can achieve the maximum damage resistance. It's also worth mentioning that the Nord starts off with a superior rank in the two-handed skill, while the Redguard is better with one-handed weapons. So if you know what kind of build you want to have with your character, you may find that you're better off with either a Nord for two-handed weapons or a Redguard for one-handed weapons. One of the worst parts about the Orcs is that they have no unique racial effect. While most races possess some kind of inherent passive resistances, or they will have abilities like water breathing, the Orc has nothing like that. This alone probably makes most players resist playing as an Orc, since you don't get the benefits that come with any kind of passive ability or passive resistances. On the upside, the Orcs do have the Berserker Rage ability as its race power, which allows the player to take half damage from enemies and deal twice as much damage, and this ability only affects physical damage output from bows and melee weapons, and doesn't affect either spells or enchantments on weapons. For this reason, orcs make really, really bad mages, possibly more so than any of the other races in Skyrim. Even still, Berserker Rage is actually a pretty powerful ability. However, like all of the other races, this ability can only be used once per day. I guess the question is, would you rather be really powerful for 1 minute, or would you rather have a passive resistance or ability that is active all of the time? Ultimately, I think it's up to you, but for me personally, I'm going to stick with the Breton. Alright guys, that's going to pretty much wrap up this particular video. If you like this video, please be sure to leave a like and let me know, what do you think is the worst or best race in Skyrim? Leave it in the comments. As always, take care and I'll see y'all next time.